Hey everybody, Josh here. Our episode last week on anti-seize was a really big one for us. A lot of people came in, nerded out. A lot of people didn't fully get it. A lot of people in the comments like, been building decks with grade 8 bolts forever, never needed this. Like, yeah, you don't. That's not the purpose. So anyway, a lot of great feedback, a lot of not so great feedback off topic like that, but it's what it is. Welcome to YouTube. Today, I thought we would kind of build on that with 5 mistakes you are probably making with fasteners. That's probably not going to be the title of this because I don't know who's going to click on that. But 5 things that I see people doing wrong, even quite frankly, some pro level like World Tour mechanics. Some of these things are easy. Some of these things people just don't know or think about. And some of it is that there's just so much misinformation out there. So we're going to cover that here today. So number 1 is dry torque or improper coating on the fastener. And one of the things that really gets me, if you just Google it, and we'll show here, scrolling the screen, there is a lot of banter out there on forums and chat rooms and places around the internet that all bolt torque specs are given dry, and that if you want to lubricate the threads or you're using an anti-seize, you need to adjust the torque to compensate for this. That is not applicable in our industry. So it is true if you pull a machinery's handbook or like a standard chart of bolt torques and tensions, those typically are built around like galvanized or CAD-coated screw with a galvanized or a CAD-coated nut. We've got known coefficients of friction. You'll see what people call like the nut coefficient or the K coefficient. You go to Home Depot, you buy screws and nuts and washers. They're all coated with the same stuff. Those are meant to be assembled dry in most instances, and the handbook value you get for that with recommended torques is going to be built around that. That truly has as much to do with your high-end bicycle as building a deck does with working on a race car. I cannot think of any fastener application in cycling that is recommended dry other than one, and that is the SRAM UDH universal derailleur hanger that they have developed. And the reason that that needs to be assembled dry is that the female threads on the derailleur hanger are actually injection molded plastic and not metal. And so that interface is an aluminum screw, male thread, threading into a female plastic thread. So many greases out there eat numerous types of plastic, and so they really don't want you putting whatever you've got laying about on there on the off chance that it may soften or damage the plastic. And it's really complicated to try to figure out what the base oil of most greases are, what the base oil of most anti-seizes are. Could they damage this type of plastic? It would be a messaging nightmare. So that very one specific thing that I can think of is don't put grease here for very good reason. I would say most other places, if they're saying not to grease, they probably have a pre-applied Loctite. So that would be your other one. The fastener for your brake levers is meant to not be tightened fully so that they can slip in the event of an accident. They are coated in a blue pre-applied Loctite type product. You don't mix greases with Loctite. So any screw or fastener that has the blue patch or the any color of Loctite applied to it, that needs to be assembled dry, because what happens is there's little like microspheres in there that burst, and they actually act as a lubricant when you're tightening, but then they actually act as a hardener for the rest of the chemical when it's fully tightened, so that you get that hardening kind of almost glue-like effect of the Loctite. So if it's metal on metal, there's no pre-applied Loctite, you need to put some sort of lubricant on that. And every stem manufacturer, seat post manufacturer, component manufacturer I have ever seen, ever come across, they're either pre-applying some sort of grease or they're telling you to apply some sort of grease. And then the torques that we are working with in cycling, typically 4 to 5 to 6 Newton meters for most small fasteners. Those are wet torque values. And then particularly your handful of higher torque, crank bolts, pedals into crank arms, those sorts of things, those are also wet torqued. And particularly at those high torques, pedals and crank bolts in particular, you really want to use an anti-seize, and if you don't have anti-seize, you want to use an EP or extreme pressure, high pressure grease in those interfaces, or you are going to risk seizing, galling issues like that over the long term. So pay attention. Dry torque almost doesn't exist in cycling. It's all wet all the time. Anyone out there in the industry who can think of another one I'm missing, please remind me. We'll put it in the next video. We don't want to be misleading people here, but if you just Google this, I think the top 10 things that show up on Google are a bunch of people quoting a bunch of kind of nonsense from other industries, or quoting, in automotive, it's this. Well, most of those automotive fasteners are dry, assembled at the factory, because they are pre-coated in some sort of lubricant or lubricant coating of known coefficient of friction value that helps and aids in the assembly of those things. So it's not actually dry as you're thinking of it. Very different from, you buy a set of titanium bolts off Amazon and you're now trying to replace the bolts in your stem. That needs to be done with grease, or wet, as they would say. Okay. Number 2 is failing to think about step torque and patterns when you are doing things like faceplates, steer clamps for stems. And there are two things going on here. One, anytime you've got a series of fasteners, like on this stem faceplate, you need to observe a pattern of tightening. And that in general, you're sort of going cross and then over and then cross again. So, sort of as we have here, kind of a 1 to 2, then 3 to 4. Following that pattern is going to allow you to gradually bring that torque value up so that you're not creating a pinch point in any one of those corners. For the backside of most stems where they clamp to the steer, you typically have 2. Some stems actually have 3 fasteners, and you want to work a pattern here as well. Just starting with a 5 Newton meter torque spec and hitting one of these bolts to 5 and then doing the others, you're going to see a couple things. One, you will create a pinch point, oftentimes geometrically, that can damage the steer tube or can damage the handlebar. But you also, as you're working the pattern, there's some sort of relaxing and moving about that happens that is changing essentially the effective bolt tension under the bolts that you've just done. So you want to work the pattern through multiple times, which gets us to this thing we call step torque. Now, step torque is the idea that as you work the pattern, you want to bring it up uniformly and consistently across the fastener. So you want to take all of these to 2, and then you want to take all of these to 4, and then you want to take all of these to 5 or to 6, whatever your final torque is. But you really want to avoid just going straight to 5. That's one of the beauties of having an adjustable torque wrench or a beam type torque wrench, like our own. This little guy and the T-ratchet and tie torque, you can pretty quickly and without having to change settings, you can go to 2, go to 4, go to 6, whatever that is. If you have another adjustable type of wrench, you do the same there. You're just adjusting it as you go, step them all up to 2, then step them up, and so on. If you only have a preset click type wrench that does 1 torque, like 5, then you just have to go by feel. But again, you're going to want to kind of all of them to the same feel, then all the way through to slightly more, all the way through to slightly more. In general, a good rule to follow is thinking about the degrees of tighten, right? So you kind of look at the side of the faceplate, make sure it's even, take them up all to a similar level of torque, hopefully 2-ish, making sure that the gap between the faceplate and the stem stays the same. And then you can think of it as, I'm going to go through and I'm going to do 90 degrees on each of them, and then 90 again, and make sure that torque is coming up slowly and consistently. That is probably the number one breaker of bolt heads that I can see, and that's actually gets to my number 3, which is non-perpendicularity under the head of the bolt. This is most commonly seen if you are failing to step torque in a stem faceplate situation, but also if you're just not paying attention. You want to look at the side of the stem. That gap, top to bottom, needs to be equal from the faceplate to the stem body, and it needs to stay equal as the torque comes up. A lot of times what you see, and back in my zip days, we saw tons and tons of this. You have a bolt that in the lab, the head will torque off at 16, 18 Newton meters, and consumers in the field are seeing the bolt heads come off at 4. Well, what's actually happening there is that those two gaps, it's becoming closed on one side, open on the other. That face under the bolt head is moving out of perpendicularity with the fastener body. And now as you're tightening, all of the force through the bolt is on one point on one side of the head, and the head gets pried off the bolt. There is nothing good about this scenario. And so that's another one that you really need to, as you're working, be watching to make sure that everything is in parallel from a stem perspective, and that will keep the surface under the bolt head perpendicular for the screw or the fastener. You will sometimes see similar failures to this at the back of the stem at the steer tube, and sometimes also on your seat post binder bolt. And in a lot of cases, this is due to some sort of tolerancing issue with one of the components. If your seat post is slightly undersized, or maybe something was painted, like your seat, a replacement seat post collar. It's probably where I see it the most. These kind of higher end, fancy, lightweight seat post collars. They may or may not be designed to compensate for, say, the paint thickness on the frame, and so you can actually have it overly opened or overly tightened, and that will pull that surface under the head out of perpendicular with the fastener. I would say the higher end versions of these you see oftentimes use cylindrical thread interfaces or bolt head interfaces, or maybe a spherical washer under the bolt head to allow for this misalignment. But again, just number 3, really try to think about keeping the surface under the head essentially in line, perpendicular to the fastener, or perfectly parallel to the undersurface of the bolt head, or you are going to have some problems. Number 4, hammer effect with click type torque wrenches. And this is one that a lot of people don't think about, but it's really important. So most of the kind of T-handled click type torque wrenches essentially in there have a ratchet that jumps and skips when the torque limit breaks free. It's quite similar to the ratchet mechanism inside of a DT free hub, if you're familiar with that. That interface is typically full of grease, and those products are typically within, call it half a Newton meter plus or minus, but they will change in their torque value reading. If it's cold, that grease is stiffer. They will actually apply more torque. If it's hot, the grease is thinner. They'll apply less. If you are turning it and it's click, 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 you are smacking, in a lot of cases, that grease out. And you're also having the ratchet is jumping, and the faces are landing while you're still applying force. And you can have a situation where you are having these intermittent spikes, or what we call hammer effect, where that 5 Newton meters may now be 7 or 8 Newton meters intermittently, and it's hammering away on that fastener. So you really want to avoid the click, click, click. And I have seen World Tour mechanics do this, where they just, turn it and just goes zzz, like 10 clicks in a row, and you'll actually see the fastener moving. I mean, you can have a fastener you've tightened to 5, and then you give it a big turn and you give it 10 clicks, and you will see that fastener physically rotate to something that is now way more than 5. You need to be careful with that. Similarly, on the click type ratchet style wrenches, you always want to hold perpendicular to the fastener with one hand, and you want to slowly click and be mindful that there's a break in there, but then it catches so that it doesn't swing totally free. If you don't fully release your hand pressure before you hit that stop, you can actually cause a secondary torque spike in that fastener. Again, the same hammer effect, where maybe it breaks free at 5, but if you're not off of it quickly enough, or you have too much force going into it, you hit that stop and you might spike it to 8 or 10. And so this is a very technique-related thing on that you just have to kind of practice with and learn, but do not get in the habit of just going click, 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 or click, click, click with a T-handle, because this hammer effect will cause these intermittent torque spikes beyond the number that you're looking for. And like I said, I'm sure that we've all done it. I've seen it done at every mechanic level, from home mechanic to world tour. But just think about what you're doing and really be mindful to just take a little bit more time. And then my last one, worn tool heads and improper use of the ball end of the hex key. And I'm going to put these two together. If you watch our HX1 video, which we'll link below, we talk about, why expensive hex keys are expensive and why they're important. The big ones are that the harder steels, they wear much slower and they hold their geometry much better. We've got this graphic that we used in that video, we'll put up here, where you can see, this is essentially a load, a medium grade hex key that was done in a reverse torque situation, 25 times or 30 times, I think. And you can see the deformation being caused here. If you are using 10-year-old hex keys, and half of them came from IKEA sets or whatever, and they have any discoloration at all on their ends, you are probably putting some undue stress inside the hex of the fasteners on your bike, and particularly if you have titanium or aluminum fasteners, you are really risking some painful rounding of the head by using these worn out hex tools. So take a look at your hex tools. This is a thing I love to do when we go into bike shops. Really look at the tools on the mechanics benches. I know it's hard to get yourself to spend the money to replace tools that seem like they're working, but throw some calipers on there, just visually inspect them, and if there's anything that looks out of place on that, you really just need to think about just how much money that can actually cost you. It really is one of those where a couple dollars saved on a tool can cost you hundreds of dollars on a high-end stem or seat post or another component on the bicycle. Not to mention the hours of time, particularly if you round the head out and now you've got to drill and use an easy out. I mean, I have seen this cost hours of time, and this is why mechanics at the very highest end really do buy the super expensive hex keys from brands like us. There's others out there. PB Swiss is a good one if you don't want to buy SILCA. But that is why a tool like this can cause so much pain and suffering, and so be mindful of it. I'm adding to this one improper use of the ball end. People love the ball end. We actually used to sell a set that had no ball ends, and sadly the only people buying them were the pro mechanics, a lot of whom really despise ball ends because they're so easy to misuse. A lot of shop owners actually will cut the ball ends off so that the employees don't use them wrongly. The thing to remember about the ball end is that it is only for spinning a fastener in or out. It is not at all for torquing. There just is not enough surface area, contact area inside of the head to use the ball end to apply any torque, be it to tighten or to loosen. So you really need to be mindful of that. If you don't have enough access with a traditional hex key, they make very short overhang hex keys, and they make 45-degree angle hex keys and a bunch of other specialty tools for incredibly tight areas like that. But you should never, ever be tightening or loosening to any sort of torque beyond touching with the ball end of the hex key. So there we go, 5 common mistakes. Let me know what other ones you guys can think of below. We can address those in future videos. Please share your stories, share your comments, hit the like, hit the subscribe, and we look forward to seeing you next time.